Good evening, class. This evening we're going to be looking at lesson 6.7, subtraction with renaming. So let's begin by looking at our essential question. How can you use renaming to find the difference of two mixed numbers? And remember, difference signifies that we will be using subtraction. Let's take a look at our word problem. To practice for a race, Kara is running 2.5 miles. When she reaches the end of her street, she knows that she has already run 1 5/6 miles. How many miles does Kara have left to run? Well, let's think about a few things. First off, let's underline the sentence that tells you what you need to find. Well, that's always going to be our question sentence. So let's underline how many miles does Kara have left to run? Now let's look at the second part of that. What operation should you use to solve the problem? Well, we know that she wants to run 2.5 miles and that she has already run 1 5/6 miles, and it says how many miles does Kara have left? Left signifies subtraction, so we know that we will be using subtraction. All right, let's look at one way that we can do this. It says to rename the first mixed number. So we would subtract 2.5 minus 1 5/6. So step 1 says to estimate the difference. So if we look at 2.5, we see that it already has a bench of a half, so we can pretty much leave that fraction alone. So 2.5 minus, and then when we look at our second mixed number, 1 5/6, we see that we are only one piece away from having a whole, so we would actually round that up to 2. So 2.5 minus 2 equals 1/2. That is our estimate for our answer. Now, step 2 says to find a common denominator. Use the common denominator to write equivalent fractions with like denominators. So when we look over here, we see that we have found a common denominator of 12 between 2 and 6. We know that we could have also used 6 because we know that 6 is a multiple of 2 and 6 is a multiple of 6. So we're going to rename 2 6/12 as a mixed number with a fraction greater than 1. And that would be 1 18/12. And that's because we take 12 away from that, which would leave us with 1, and then we would add that 12 to our 6, which would equal 1 18/12. And then we can simply bring over 1 10/12 to subtract. So when we do 18 minus 10, that leaves us with 8/12, and 1 minus 1 is 0. So our answer is 8/12. Now we can simplify that to 2/3. So Kara has 2/3 mile left to run. So down at the bottom it says, explain why it is important to write equivalent fractions before renaming. Well, it is important to write equivalent fractions first to determine if renaming is even needed. Now let's take a look at another way that we can do it, and that is to rename both mixed numbers as fractions greater than 1. So when we would subtract 2 1/2 minus 1 5/6, it says again to write equivalent fractions using a common denominator. So technically we could have done 2 1/2, and we know that if we look at our multiples of 2 and 6, it would be 2, 6, 2, 4, 6, and we can already stop because we see our least common denominator is 6. And we know that 2 times 3 equals 6, and 1 times 3 equals 3, because whatever we do to the denominator, we have to do to the numerator. And this one is going to stay the same because it already had a denominator of 6. 6. So that leaves us with 2 and 3/6 minus 1 and 5/6. So let's look at step 2. It says to rename both mixed numbers as fractions greater than 1. So we know that we can do 6 times 2 is 12, 13, 14, 15. So it would be 15, 6, and then 6 times 1 is 6, plus 5 is 11, 6. And now we can simply subtract it out. So we have 15, 6 minus 11, 6. And we know when we're adding or subtracting fractions, we only add or subtract the numerators. The 15 minus 11 is 4. The denominator stays the same at 6, so we end up with 4, 6. Now we also know that we can simplify this by dividing the numerator and the denominator by 2. So our answer after simplifying is 2/3. So 2 and 1/2 minus 1 and 5/6 equals 2/3. So now let's turn in our manuals and go ahead and write down our password for tonight's lesson. Our password says, Dominique spent 3 3/4 hours at play practice on Tuesday and 1.5 hours on Thursday. How much longer did she spend at play practice on Tuesday than on Thursday? Is it 1/4 hour, 2 1/4 hours, 2 1/2 hours, or 5 1/4 hours? Be sure to record the answer in your journal and bring it with you to class tomorrow. See you then.